Somehow or another, Link finds out that he'll need to find the Lens of Truth hidden in a mini-dungeon at the bottom of the well in Kakariko Village in order to proceed with his adventure. This mini-dungeon makes a strong impression for a bunch of different reasons. There's its preamble, where you have to learn a song as adult Link that child Link then teaches to the same person who taught him the song in the future, creating a fun time paradox. The mini-dungeon also has an infamously creepy aesthetic, being a literal dungeon, as in a place where people are imprisoned and tortured. The place is littered with blood-stained torture devices, shambling zombies, disembodied hands, and flaming skulls. In other words, a bunch of things that you wouldn't want in the well where you're getting your drinking water. Also, the boss is this pale, creepy guy named Dead Hand, who burrows underground waiting for a chance to spring up and shuffle menacingly at Link. You do the whole thing as child Link, by the way, which only deepens the creepiness of it all. All of that stuff is perfectly lovely and worthwhile. What I instead want to focus on, for now, is the unusual design and gameplay of the bottom of the well, because they bring some interesting revelations. So, you enter the bottom of the well. What is your list of tasks? First, you hop across a small reservoir of water next to the entrance. Follow the stream to its source, at the back of the mini-dungeon's large central room. Play Zelda's Lullaby when you see the crest of Hyrule's royal family, which lowers the water level. Go back to the entrance, crawl through a hole at the bottom of the now empty reservoir, and meet the dungeon's boss, Dead Hand. Defeat it, collect the Lens of Truth, marvel at its ability to dispel illusions, and leave. That's it. Or is it? You see, for as simple as the critical path through the bottom of the well is, its design serves to confound, confuse, and frustrate the player. The specifics of how this mini-dungeon will confound, confuse, and frustrate you depends on what path you take when you first enter. So let's get into the specifics of how this space is designed. You enter the mini-dungeon at the bottom of the well, obviously by going to the bottom of a dried-up well. You reach what appears to be a dead end, but this wall is an illusion, and you can pass right through it. After this, you emerge into the mini-dungeon's proper entrance, its central room. This central room, a sort of aqueduct, is shaped like a rectangular ring. Immediately in front of you is a small reservoir of water. Feeding this reservoir is a stream on your left and a stream on your right. So, let's say that you have what is, according to some research, the typical American brain configuration that compels you to go through stores counterclockwise. Or maybe you caught a glimpse of that skull wreathed in green flame as it passed by and wanted to flag it down. Whatever your reasons may be, let's say that you decide to make a right turn. You circle along the room's counterclockwise path until Navi the fairy turns green to get your attention and flies over to a plate on the wall with a strange face carved into it. Navi tells you that the face is saying, "Danger below." Danger below what? You move to get a closer look and discover that, like the wall at the entrance, this section of the floor is an illusion, deviously hiding a pit to a lower floor, and now you have to claw your way back up. Okay, let's rewind. Arriving in the mini-dungeon's central room, you take a left turn. Fuck the psychological programming of American retail, and fuck skulls wreathed in green flames. You go left, heading along the room's clockwise path. A big skulltula drops on you unexpectedly. It was hiding above an illusory ceiling. A face carved into the wall helpfully informs you, after you've already encountered the big spider, that there is danger above. Thanks. You deal with the spider and move along, arriving at the royal family's crest. You play Zelda's Lullaby, and the big statue that the water is pouring from stops pouring. The dungeon's streams and reservoirs dry up. Now what? You didn't see that there was a hole you could crawl into in that reservoir at the beginning, so you have no reason to return to it. But you can see a hole that you can crawl into at the end of this hallway. You start to run towards it, only to fall into the pit in front of the carved face that says danger below. Again, you have to claw your way back up. Okay, let's rewind. Arriving in the mini-dungeon's central room, you see a path to your left and a path to your right, but you, genius that you are, can cut through all the lies and the bullshit. You head straight ahead into what seems to be a wall, revealing it to be an illusion, just like the illusory wall at the entrance. You emerge through this second illusory wall into a truly effed up room for sickos. Jail cells are on your left and your right, and a torture device resembling a wooden cross, only angled like an X instead of standing up straight like a T, sits in the center of this room. The floor in front of the wooden cross is stained with blood. You go to investigate, and after getting interrupted by Navi helpfully informing you to watch for the shadows of monsters that hang from the ceiling, thanks Navi, discover that the blood-stained floor is an illusion, and you fall into the pit. Again, you have to claw your way back up. Okay, we are done rewinding. Now, those petulant babies among you in the audience may now be throwing a big baby fit and crying foul. It is, after all, possible to avoid any of the pits that I've mentioned. It's technically possible to take the shortest possible route, as I described earlier, where you simply drain the water and return to the dry reservoir near the mini-dungeon's entrance, and face the boss right away. But there are so many deviously placed pits that will likely deter you. I mentioned two already, the danger below pit and the pit under the wooden cross. There's also one hiding in front of the treasure chest with the compass, and one hiding next to this big pile of shit. Now, that aforementioned compass points you in the direction of treasure chests, where you can get some keys. Those keys unlock doors, behind which you will find even more pits. There are 3 more invisible pits behind one of the locked doors, in this room with the laser shooting statue and the flaming bats. Meanwhile, the mini-dungeon's sole visible pit lies behind the locked door on the eastern side of the torture chamber. Talking about the locations of all the pits is also a roundabout way of pointing out that this mini-dungeon, miniature as it may be, still has the full complement of a map, a compass, and 3 keys, which all serve the primary purpose of misleading the player. The compass shows you where the treasure chests are, even though all but one of the treasures in this dungeon are unnecessary. The map doesn't indicate the tunnel to the boss chamber, nor does it warn you about where the pits are. Using these 2 items to go on a treasure chest hunt is liable to inadvertently lead you downstairs. Furthermore, none of the 3 keys are actually required to reach the boss. The 3 dungeons that preceded this mini-dungeon, the Forest Temple, the Fire Temple, and the Water Temple, were all designed around keys and locked doors. If you find a key, you're going to look for a locked door. Likewise, if you see a locked door, it's reasonable to assume that it is the proper way forward and look for a key. Here at the bottom of the well, these locked doors aren't completely pointless. Each one leads to a gold skulltula, but the hunt for gold skulltulas is completely immaterial to the task at hand of finding the lens of truth, so their presence here just feels like part of this mini-dungeon's big trick. More time spent poking around at the bottom of the well, finding keys, unlocking doors, getting treasure chests, bombing big piles of shit, means more opportunities to fall into pits because you didn't know they were there. It means more opportunities to fall into pits even though you did know they were there because you saw that a wallmaster was about to grab you and you panicked. It means constantly hitting dead ends with a gold skulltula as a consolation prize. The more time the player spends getting run around like this, the more intimidating and confusing this allegedly miniature dungeon is going to feel. Personally, I drove myself nuts the first time I got to this part doing all of that, only to find out that, in the end, all I had to do is go back near the entrance and notice that there's a hole that I can crawl through. Ocarina of Time's dungeons tell all sorts of stories. The bottom of the well is telling a joke, and the more time you spend banging your head against it, the more devastating the punchline ends up being. Here you go. Here's your lens of truth. Now you can see all the pits your dumb ass was stumbling into. Bet you wish you had this earlier, huh? But it's not just a joke for its own sake. It lends the mini dungeon a feeling of being arbitrary and capricious, quite fitting for something that's supposed to be a literal dungeon where people are tortured. A player who spends an unnecessarily long time before finding the lens of truth may be left feeling worn and haggard, desperate to see sunlight again. Also interesting is the player who gets lucky and finds the lens of truth right away. Maybe they leave and are left with a lingering sense of unfinished business. Or maybe they stick around, find all the gold skulltulas, and then leave, carrying with them the uneasy sense that they spent too much time in a place where they weren't welcome. Or maybe that lucky player just feels like they wasted their time doing chores, that they wish Dead Hand could have been given the pomp and circumstance of a proper boss encounter so they would know that defeating it is their cue to leave the mini dungeon. There's an infinite range of feelings one can have in response here. The experience of a Legend of Zelda dungeon is just as much about making mistakes and having misunderstandings as it is about completing the necessary tasks. Even for someone with an encyclopedic knowledge of Ocarina of Time, there is still the lingering awareness of what it felt like the first time, or what you can imagine it might feel like for others. The bottom of the well, like all of the dungeons in this game, has so much more going on than a simple checklist can indicate. But I do want to focus on just one of the items on the checklist, because it leads to some interesting places. If you're unlucky enough to fall into one of this mini dungeon's numerous pits, you'll land in this basement room. The basement has an unusual shape, vaguely resembling a hand with a missing ring finger. Save for a pit of green acid where the palm of the hand would be, it's sparsely decorated, being mostly brown cave walls. As I mentioned several times already, falling into this room means you will have to claw your way back up. Most of the pits land you in one of the fingers, so you have to run to the palm and then climb up a ladder to get back to where you were before. However, it isn't enough to just climb up the ladder. You'll encounter a barred door. In order to open the door, you have to engage with a mechanic that, across the entire Legend of Zelda series, has only appeared in Ocarina of Time: collecting silver rupees. The way the mechanic works is pretty simple. Collect a few silver rupees that are scattered around the room and a barred door opens up. This is subjective, of course, but the silver rupee mechanic has always stuck out to me as unusually artificial and video gamey. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, of course, but I think the Legend of Zelda series, especially in its three-dimensional entries, typically strives for a bit more verisimilitude. Even contrivances like the eye-shaped switches that you have to shoot with an arrow to open a door imply some kind of mechanism. Still, I find the placement of silver rupees here at the bottom of the well to make a kind of sense. I'm not really basing this off of anything in particular, so it might sound like bullshit, but it almost feels like Link has fallen into hell and has to retrieve lost souls in order to earn his way out. I'm less inclined to come up with reasons for the placement of silver rupees across the rest of the game, though. It's not that I particularly dislike this mechanic, it's just that I find it to be a useful marker of roughly the final third of Ocarina of Time, where the game's construction starts to feel a bit more haphazard. So, for that reason, I call this portion of the game the Silver Rupee arc. It's not a clean division. The first appearance of silver rupees is in the Ice Cavern, a mini dungeon that definitely sticks out as being strange and incongruous with the parts of the game preceding it. The Ice Cavern is followed by the Water Temple, which, for all the frustrations it has caused the broader gaming public, expresses strong and coherent ideas all throughout, and features no silver rupees. Silver rupees return soon after, at the bottom of the well, which also has a strong, coherent design, albeit in a style inconsistent with the rest of the game. After that, though, the Shadow Temple is a great example of what I mean when I talk about the Silver Rupee arc. It's a collection of half-formed ideas of its own, mixed with rooms that felt like they were rejects from other dungeons. And, of course, it prominently features silver rupees. The Gerudo Fortress after this is a section I personally have some affection for, but which definitely could have used a bit more time in the oven. There are no silver rupees there, but the spirit spirit of the Silver Rupee arc is still present. The Gerudo Fortress also connects to another feature that is unique to Ocarina of Time, a bonus dungeon. The Gerudo Training Ground has a surprisingly compelling and coherent design, but its place in the game overall, being an optional dungeon that seems to be intended to be completed piecemeal at various points in the game, feels a bit strange. Moving away from that piece of optional content, we get to the Spirit Temple, which, like the Shadow Temple, exhibits all the traits that I used to define the Silver Rupee arc. The Spirit Temple often feels like a random collection of ideas, and, like the Shadow Temple, prominently features silver rupees. But, unlike the Shadow Temple, there is an overall sense of cohesion and some strong thematic concepts to it that manage to shine through regardless. And then, after the Spirit Temple, we've gathered all of the sages and are ready to use their power to take on the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, where we are again met with a bunch of rooms randomly stapled together and, of course, plenty of silver rupees. Maybe it's just a quirk of my personality, but I find it hard to characterize any part of Ocarina of Time in any one way or another. For example, people usually break the game into the child section and the adult section, but I have refrained from doing so here. First, because the child section is considerably shorter than the adult section, and also because, after all, you are required to travel back and forth in time, switching between child and adult forms. I've had to come up with my own ways of describing parts of the game, figuring out cutoffs that make sense to me. For the most part, I haven't been able to do that. I can break the game roughly into thirds, but I could only think of a name for the final third. So, in a way, I'm grateful to the Silver Rupees for giving me that opportunity. It's a common phenomenon in video games to reach a point where the game design becomes noticeably weaker, often as a result of the developers being rushed to meet development deadlines. One of the best examples, in fact, comes from the Legend of Zelda series. Rushed to meet its release date late in 2002, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker had to cut large amounts of content in the late portions of the game, seemingly replacing what would have been fully featured dungeons with quick, simple platforming challenges, and then making up for the lost time by sending the player on a lengthy, tedious scavenger hunt across the game world. There's nothing comparable in Ocarina of Time, but there is clearly a sense that the design gradually starts to feel different, hence why I point to silver rupees. This mechanic isn't a perfect marker of the change in design, but that feels consistent with the play experience of Ocarina of Time, a game that often resists being cleanly divided up. There is plenty of good stuff in the Silver Rupee arc. The mini dungeon at the bottom of the well is one of my favorite parts of the game, but this mini dungeon is also a prelude to the Shadow Temple, which is my least favorite part of Ocarina of Time. In order to articulate why, I need to focus my attention elsewhere for the time being. So I will jump to the game's finale, to the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, which I think provides an effective baseline for talking about the design of the Silver Rupee arc. Once you've gotten all 6 sages, they team up to create a rainbow bridge across the lake of lava where Hyrule Castle used to be, granting Link access to the floating jet-black structure where Ganondorf resides. The bulk of this dungeon consists of dispelling the dark barrier surrounding the castle's central tower. In order to do this, you have to complete 6 areas themed after the 6 sages and their respective temples. Well, loosely themed, even setting aside the section devoted to the Sage of Light, which didn't have a dungeon to base itself on. The actual relationship between a section of the dungeon inside Ganon's castle and its corresponding temple is handled inconsistently. These sections can be tackled in a few different orders, so I'll just talk about them in the order that I always do them in. The forest-themed section, for example, bears little resemblance to its Forest Temple counterpart. It has a short introductory room with a wolfos and some unlit torches. You need to light the torches to open up the door to the next room. You cast the magic spell Din's Fire to light the torches on the ground, and then light the torch near the ceiling using a fire arrow. Or you can angle a shot with a normal arrow through one of the lit torches. Ocarina of Time is filled with little moments like this, low-stakes places to exhibit just a little bit more skill and understanding than is strictly required. It's simple, but it's effective. Also worth mentioning is that defeating the Wolfos makes a treasure chest appear. The prize? 5 rupees. This is a sort of minor recurring theme of the Silver Rupee arc. Treasure chests with really underwhelming prizes, like 5 rupees or a single recovery heart. This sort of trickery makes sense at the bottom of the well and in the Shadow Temple, because those are areas devoted to trickery. It makes a bit less sense in the Spirit Temple. In universe, it's a den of thieves, so I can reach for that as a justification. But here inside Ganon's castle, it feels especially strange. Ganondorf is a big, imposing villain, not a mischievous one. Aside from that short introductory room, the bulk of the forest section is in the next room, a puzzle platforming challenge requiring the use of the hover boots in combination with gusts of wind from fans in order to collect 5 silver rupees. It's a solid little challenge, but much more closely resembles the Shadow Temple than the Forest Temple. The Shadow Temple, after all, is the place where you get the hover boots, and it's the only other place where those fans appear. The spirit-themed section feels more perfunctory in terms of gameplay, but bears a greater resemblance to its temple counterpart. The first room involves collecting silver rupees while moving statues around to control the movement of sliding blade traps. I like the way this room combines puzzle and action elements, but this is a very simple combination happening very late in the game. I always end up brute forcing it too, just taking the damage from the sliding blade traps so I don't have to deal with the too slow process of moving statues around. The second room consists of the game's only puzzle requiring the use of bomb chews, a type of bomb resembling a stylized mechanical mouse that crawls along the ground in a straight line and can climb walls. Bomb chews occupy a strange space in this game in general. They're never randomly dropped, like say arrows and normal bombs are, so obtaining them is only possible through winning them as a prize in a minigame, finding them inside a scant few treasure chests, and buying them from 2 merchants, both of whom are a bit of a pain to locate. Their supplies are more limited than most other items in the game, and controlling where they end up is pretty finicky. So it's a mixed blessing that the puzzle here simply involves lining up an easy shot. Really, I wonder why they even bothered having it at all. After that's finished, the last part of this section involves using a fire arrow to burn some cobwebs and let light into the room, and then using the mirror shield to reflect the light onto parts of the wall marked with a sun emblem. This is a near direct lift from the Spirit Temple, and is, if anything, simpler than the already simple implementations of this concept seen in that dungeon. But that's not necessarily a problem. Earlier, I spoke about a similar kind of repetition in the Fire Temple, but the problem in that case was that the repetition was happening within the same dungeon, where it is more reasonable to expect a repeated challenge to also be escalated in difficulty. In this case, inside Ganon's castle, it feels like a deliberate callback to something you did earlier, showing the dungeon inside Ganon's castle to be a sort of victory lap, where you get to breeze through using all the tools you've accumulated so far. The water-themed section bears absolutely no resemblance to the Water Temple, and instead is based on the Ice Cavern mini-dungeon which precedes the Water Temple. This section of the dungeon inside Ganon's castle consists of 2 rooms. The first is kind of a mess. It has 2 ice-breathing monsters that you have to destroy to open up a barred door. In order to reach this door, you have to melt some red ice. In order to melt the red ice, you have to bottle up and deliver some blue flame. This blue flame is found in a sconce that is a very short distance away from the red ice. It's pretty banal, even by the basic standards of Ocarina of Time's challenges. The room is also filled with dropping icicles, and has 2 small treasure chests, one of which grants you a single recovery heart, and the other of which is a trap that freezes and damages you if you open it. A bizarre room with no central focus, but also not enough elements to feel like a proper madhouse either. The second room of this section fares a little bit better, being a simple sliding block puzzle. Like the room with the sun emblems from the Spirit section, it's a reminder of something the player had to do earlier in the game, and the simplification is even more stark this time. The only other sliding block puzzle in the game is in the Ice Cavern, and that's one of the most complicated single-room puzzles in the game. The comparative simplicity of the version inside Ganon's castle conveys a quiet sort of empowerment through familiarity. You You've seen this before, and without any additional prompting, you know how to deal with it. Unfortunately, the room also has a time limit, presumably the amount of time Link can spend in here without dying of hypothermia. This isn't the only cold area in Ocarina of Time, but it's the only instance where cold presents an issue like this. It feels random that it only happens this late in the game, especially since it doesn't even introduce significant pressure. The puzzle in here is unlikely to keep you occupied for 2 full minutes. The biggest hitch is that this room also requires bottled blue flame, so you can get right up to the end only to realize that you need to go back to the previous room, get the blue flame, and then have to go back to redo the block puzzle, which is annoying, but this section is so compact that it's an annoyance that is quickly overcome. The water-themed section, along with the shadow-themed section, are the only ones out of the 6 to not involve silver rupees, by the way. The absence of silver rupees is especially strange because the shadow section feels like a sequel to the forest section, albeit one that doesn't contain the blowing fans. And like the forest section, I'm pretty fond of the platforming challenges seen here, though I do have some caveats. This room makes effective use of Link's bag of tricks. The hook shot is useful here, but that's hardly noteworthy on its own. By most metrics, the hook shot is the most used item in the entire game. But the shadow-themed section also finds use for the Ocarina, as playing the Song of Time makes some floating blocks appear that assist in navigation. You can also use the hover boots to make some of the jumps a little more forgiving. It also finds use for the fire arrow, which is used to light a torch that creates some more floating platforms, which disappear after a short amount of time. In order to open up the exit door, you have to hit a rusty switch with the Megaton hammer. And finally, the final stretch of road, a narrow, winding path, is invisible until being revealed with the lens of truth. The variety here is appreciated, and the timed platforming challenge is serviceable, even if I think that the forest theme section had a more fun platforming challenge. But I did say that my fondness of this shadow-themed section inside Ganon's castle comes with some caveats. And despite how brief this section of the game is, these caveats actually serve as a jumping-off point to discuss a general oddity that pervades throughout all of Ocarina of Time. The short version is this. The shadow-themed section makes use of a wide variety of Link's tools, but doesn't necessarily require the use of all of those tools. There's a surprising variety of ways to complete this section, but that variety manifests in a way that makes the section feel unfocused. So, now, the long version. There's a word that comes to mind when I try to synthesize all my thoughts about the design of this game, and that word is indecisive. Not because I feel indecisive, but because the game itself feels indecisive. This indecision manifests in a few different ways, but I think one of the clearest ways it manifests is in the game's progression. That is, the order in which different events occur. There's a series of interviews where many important figures in Ocarina of Time's development reflect, more than a decade later, on the game's development process. At one point, they talk about how aspects of the game were often designed before the designers were certain how these aspects would fit into the rest of the game. So, for example, sometimes Link's different tools were designed just because the designers thought that they would be interesting, and then already existing dungeons had to be retrofitted to make use of those tools. Sometimes a tool that seemed interesting as it was being designed didn't end up having interesting applications. Sometimes a tool obtained in one dungeon would negate an important challenge in a different dungeon. Or maybe a dungeon would use multiple tools, and the designers would have to make sure that the events of the game would be sequenced in such a way to ensure that the player has everything they need when they enter a dungeon. The shadow-themed section of the dungeon inside Ganon's castle really demonstrates all the logistical problems that can arise as a result of giving the player an evolving set of tools. This room makes use of the Ocarina of Time, that is the actual item, not the video game of the same title, the hook shot, the fire arrow, the hover boots, the lens of truth, and the Megaton hammer. The game's sequencing guarantees that the player will have all of these items except the fire arrow. Now, the fire arrow is pretty easy to obtain, and it's not far off the beaten path, but just in case you missed it, this shadow-themed section is nice enough to provide you with an alternative route. But if you make clever use of the hookshot, you can get up close to the unlit torch and light it with Din's fire, an item that, unlike the fire arrow, the game has actually guaranteed the player has by this point. This alternative solution relies on combining tricky platforming with some creative use of the hover boots, so it feels more like a workaround than an actual solution, even if the designers put it there on purpose. Meanwhile, the hover boots, which, again, the player is guaranteed to have by this point, allow the player to just completely ignore portions of the timed platforming challenge. The strangest aspect of all of this relates to the Ocarina of Time, that is, the actual item, not the video game of the same title. If you play the Song of Time, some blocks appear. Earlier, I said that they assist navigation, but that isn't really true. At least, it's not true in any meaningful way for a player who is playing the game normally. Normally, I would use the hookshot to reach the platform with this small treasure chest. If I play the Song of Time, though, I can reach the chest without the hookshot. But the treasure chest only contains 5 rupees, and the platform doesn't provide any particular advantage for shooting a fire arrow at the unlit torch. In fact, as long as you have the fire arrow, this section never once requires the use of the hookshot. In fact, setting aside everything about the game up until this point, I think the most interesting, coherent approach to this room is to pretend like you don't have the hookshot or the hover boots, because both of those things allow you to ignore elements of the platforming challenge. Like I said, I appreciate the challenges in this section, and to some extent, I appreciate the variety of approaches that are possible here. But that variety feels more like a consequence of Ocarina of Time's hectic development than anything else. I can't prove this, but it is the feeling I'm left with. The shadow-themed section presents another oddity. This section is where Link opens the treasure chest containing the golden gauntlets. The golden gauntlets enhance Link's strength so that he can lift up these huge black pillars. One of them blocks the entrance to the light-themed section, and one of them blocks a single silver rupee inside of the fire-themed section. This has always felt strange to me. The framing of the scene in the center of the dungeon sort of implies that you can take on the different sections in any order that you want. If nothing else, it seems strange to block entry into the light section entirely, but then only block off a part of the fire section. This blocked off part of the fire section is still necessary in order to complete it, so the pillar might as well have been right in front of the door, just like it was for the light section. The fire-themed section does at least do a good job representing its respective temple. Like the fire temple, the fire section of the dungeon inside Ganon's castle is centered around platforming, and it's a type of platforming with a different flavor to the kind found in the forest and shadow sections. Rather than being centered around precise navigation and careful decision-making, the fire section gives the player a wider space and more room for error, but puts them under constant time pressure and inspires a more frantic approach through platforms that sink into the lava, and this statue that spins around spitting flames. Even though the fire temple proper didn't have silver rupees, this section feels like a solid representation of that dungeon in miniature. It even has the ambushes by our old pals, the Flaming Skulls. The light-themed section is another odd one. Like I said earlier, it's not based on any actual dungeon, nor does it have a strong mechanical identity of its own. The first room has a locked door and 6 treasure chests, none of which contains a key. Instead, you have to defeat a few invisible enemies to cause the treasure chest with the key to appear. The next room also has a locked door, but you just have to play Zelda's Lullaby at the royal family's crest to make a treasure chest with a key appear. The room after that involves collecting silver rupees, but in an abnormally small space, requiring the player to avoid 2 rolling boulders that feel like they take up most of the room. After that, you arrive at what appears to be the final room. The previous sections of this dungeon all ended the same way, in identical looking rooms that each have a big sinister orb that you have to shoot with a light arrow, which destroys the orb and allows the respective sage to lend their power in breaking the seal on the dark barrier blocking the central tower. This room at the end of the light-themed section, however, contains no orb. What to do? Well, it turns out this room is a phony. You just walk through a fake wall and arrive safe and sound in the real room, in front of the real orb. Thank Goddess. With that, the 6th and final of the sections is completed, granting access to the central tower. It's worth reflecting on all 6 of those sections on the whole, because my mixed feelings here, in this dungeon, resemble the mixed feelings I have across the rest of the game. One of the frustrating things I discovered over the course of writing this whole goddamn thing is that you have to work a lot harder to explain why an area isn't conveying anything coherent than you would to explain an area that is conveying an idea coherently. I have had to scrap a lot of this essay because I was getting too down in the dirt explaining how the game often kinda sets up expectations that it only kinda delivers on. Ocarina of Time is a game that is constantly gesturing vaguely in the general direction of things that may or may not be there, and I end up sounding like the world's lowest stakes conspiracy theorist trying to explain what I mean by that. To that end, I appreciate the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, because it gives clear examples of both the not quite setups and their corresponding not quite payoffs. I've already talked about the indecision I see in the shadow-themed section, and how it reflects the broader sense of indecision I see in Ocarina of Time with regards to sequencing. But indecision crops up in different forms, and I think you can see one of those forms in the way the dungeon inside Ganon's castle is presented. So, you have a big central room that kinda sets up the idea of being able to complete a few different sections in whatever order you want, but it also kinda sets up the idea that the light theme section is supposed to be the final one. But the light section can be done pretty quickly if you want to, as long as you do the shadow section first. And you might as well do the light section quickly because it's not really any sort of climax. Except for the fake-out final room, which probably works better if you've clearly established the pattern of what the final room of a section should look like. Also, you would kinda expect the different sections to be based on the corresponding temples, but then if you go through the forest section first, you might think that all the different sections are doing their own thing, only to find out that most of them are referencing their corresponding temple. Well, it depends on whether or not you count the water section, which isn't referencing the water temple, but instead the ice cavern mini dungeon that immediately precedes the water temple. Look, I could keep hemming and hawing about this for a long fucking time. Maybe one day I'll release my rough drafts, so you can see all the places where I had to cut out that kind of hemming and hawing. But for now, let me just say this. For all the issues I just illustrated with the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, you still walk away understanding the general idea. The game's final dungeon references the dungeons you did previously, and while later Legend of Zelda games would express this idea more coherently, the way it's expressed here is, like, fine. It's fine enough. Really, aside from being fine, I think it has its own unique strengths in the way it lets the player snag some easy victories while also reminding them of old frustrations and pulling some new tricks. It's also paced pretty well. These slower-paced action puzzle platforming challenges open up the central tower, which is just a set of arena combat encounters against increasingly dramatic foes, separated by curving staircase corridors. First, you face off against two Dynalfos, which are the more fearsome siblings to the Lizalfos that you fought back in Dodongo's cavern. Then you're pitted against two Stalfos, the skeleton warriors featured prominently in the Forest Temple and Shadow Temple. Then, finally, right before challenging Ganondorf, you face off against two Iron Knuckles, an enemy that was already challenging by itself when you faced it in the Spirit Temple. If the dull gray visuals of the room where you access all the action puzzle platforming challenges, along with the mostly recycled visuals of the challenges themselves, had you convinced that the game was running out of aesthetic ideas, the climb up the tower will convince you otherwise. In moments like these, you really see how Ocarina of Time benefits from its palette, which is pretty dull and washed out most of the time. It makes the bold, saturated visuals found in places like the tower in the dungeon inside Ganon's castle stand out even more. This actually starts a little bit before the climb up the central tower. Before arriving in the hub room that connects to all the different sections, the first room of the dungeon inside Ganon's castle is a simple stairwell leading down. Torches on each side of the stairwell only seem to barely light up the dull dark haze that blankets this first room. The running theme of this dungeon's visuals is a mix of squalor and splendor, and we see clear examples of that here. On the bottom of the simple, dingy brick walls, there's a sinister-looking ornamental trim featuring a skull with what appears to be tentacles and 3 red eyes. The wall-to-wall royal purple carpet underfoot gives way to ugly gray stone floors. The purple carpeted stairwell takes you in a straight line, bringing you to the door that takes you into the main central room. The door is guarded by 2 laser-shooting BMOS statues up on pedestals. These pedestals, as well as the pedestals holding up the torches, are marked with the sign of the Triforce. The sign of the Triforce is also seen in the emblem of Hyrule's royal family, but this doesn't indicate Ganondorf's desire to continue their legacy, instead reflecting his obsession with obtaining those 3 sacred triangles. Anyway, the lasers of the BMOS statues are pretty easy to avoid, but they give an immediate sense of hostility to the place that I really appreciate. Once you break the barrier and get into the central tower, you're greeted with a room made out of dark gray stone tiles, lined with strange red gems, held up by dull green pillars, with a bright red carpet running up a staircase curving up clockwise, and leading to a door made of some green material that has golden ornamentation on it. This door leads to the first of the 3 arenas, the one where you fight the Dynalphos. It's a simple stone floors, stone walls, stone ceilings kind of affair, with a section of bright red carpet, like from the previous room, running up the stairs to the next green and gold door. The second section of curved staircase is much duller and dingier, with dark brown stone on the staircase and dark gray bricks along the wall, and no carpeting. This leads to the next green and gold door, which leads to the next arena, the one where you fight the Stalfos. This one has a surprising elegance with soft yellow lighting and orange marble walls, but they're contrasted against the scuffed up gray tiles underfoot. The curved staircase it connects to has stairs made of that same dull, dingy brown stone on the floor that was seen in the previous staircase, but carries over the most recent arena's elegant orange marble for its walls. The third and final mini-boss arena, where you fight 2 iron knuckles, is a sudden shift in color palette, with its walls and floor being made of green marble, which sharply contrasts against the red carpet in the room's center. The green marble walls and floors continue into the next curved staircase until the walls are replaced by the dark gray stone tiles lined with red gems that had previously been seen in the first staircase room. Also, instead of another green and gold door, we have a large metallic door marked with some kind of yellow sun emblem. This door can only be opened if you have the boss key, which is mostly just a formality, as the boss key treasure chest simply sits in the middle of the second of the 3 combat arenas. This metallic door with a yellow sun emblem leads into a big mysterious room that I'll talk about more in a moment. This room has another sun emblem door, which leads to the final staircase. Aside from the red carpet that you've seen a few times before, this staircase sets itself apart with architecture that suggests a cathedral, with its great stone walls lined in arched, stained glass windows. The dark room begins to brighten in an eerie, unnatural way as you ascend the stairs, and then the room starts to fill with a bizarre orange haze. The final sun emblem door, before facing Ganondorf, is set into an arch in the wall. I love these rooms leading up to Ganondorf. The colors and the architectural styles clash, but in a way that feels resonant with Ganondorf's style of villainy, the way he's imposed his will on the land of Hyrule, and specifically the site of Hyrule Castle. He's not just evil, he's also tacky, his castle a patchwork of conflicting aesthetic ideas. These bold aesthetic moves, found right at the very end of the game, give these final sequences a very clear place in the memory of the game, especially when they're placed against the duller, more washed out aesthetics in the lead up. I haven't even mentioned the diegetic organ music that increases in volume as you ascend, until you realize that it's been Ganondorf playing the organ all along. Ganondorf banging on the keys is so cool it almost sickens me. While I'm here, I might as well talk about the final boss fight, right? Well, honestly, I really don't feel the need to talk in depth about the combat aspect. The first phase, against the great king of evil, Ganondorf, in his human form, is a callback to the fight against Phantom Ganon at the end of the Forest Temple. You have to play tennis with him again. This version is actually a little bit easier than it was back in the Forest Temple. The real Ganondorf's movements are a bit slower, and the physics for deflecting his magical attacks are more predictable. There's one additional wrinkle. After winning a match of tennis and hitting his magic back at him, you have to shoot him with an arrow of light before he'll be opened up to take more damage from your sword. But this does very little to make the fight more difficult. What I find noteworthy here is the room itself. Without realizing it, you get a brief preview of the boss arena right before meeting the boss man. It's the big mysterious room I mentioned earlier, a big square room with an inexplicable climbable tower to nowhere in its center. When you enter the boss arena upstairs, Ganondorf destroys a part of the floor, revealing the arena to be the upper level of the big square room. The tower is climbable so that if Ganondorf knocks you down to the lower level, you can get back up. For some reason, that connection blew my mind when I saw my friend do the final boss when I was a kid. Then, of course, once you've defeated Ganondorf, his castle starts to fall apart, as so often happens with villainous layers. It's surprisingly engaging seeing the architecture of the castle get reinterpreted like this, with previously unseen exterior walkways taking you back through the side entrances of rooms you had fought through previously. See, you thought those metal bars blocking big holes on either side of all those small combat arenas were just there for decoration, but now they're a vital part of your dramatic escape. You thought that bridge over the entrance to the water-themed section went nowhere, but actually it's a secret exit out the castle's side. Hopefully, these minor architectural delights will distract you from the sound of Princess Zelda, who had a successful 7-year career as a badass ninja before she put her princess dress back on, daintily gasping in horror as Link gets heroically injured by falling debris. Personally, though, it's the main thing I notice about this sequence, and it bugs the piss out of me. As soon as I stopped being 16 years old, I found my defensiveness about the Legend of Zelda series' use of damsels in distress starting to subside, and came to the conclusion that Anita Sarkeesian was right in every single criticism she made about this series, and you can all die mad about that. When Link gets hurt and Princess Zelda gasps, the purpose is not to inspire empathy for her, or even for Link. It's just another technique the game uses to empower the player, by showing that they can shrug off a few nasty hits and continue moving through sheer force of will. The game already does so much to create its power fantasy, and that's fine, or at least more or less neutral. But the older I get, the less patience I have for this notion of empowerment through shrugging off pain, especially if it is also another instance of how Princess Zelda is objectified. This may seem like a nitpick, but you have to consider that this game is using a very small set of tools to characterize her, so little things like this gasp matter way more. And when the rest of her characterization is that she helps you open doors, that she gets trapped in a burning ring of fire while you get to fight off some skeleton warriors, and that she tells you where your sword is so you can finish off the bad guy, well, there's a clear pattern of disempowerment of a woman for the purpose of empowering the male main character, and it's made, if not worse, maybe a little bit more disappointing when the early portions of the game used a similarly small set of tools to convey a version of Princess Zelda who had a little bit more interiority, with just a smidge more to do than kiss a hero's wounds. And I don't want to be prescriptive and say that the next Legend of Zelda game should star a playable Princess Zelda, or a female Link, or whatever. There are a lot of ways to create a good woman character in a video game, and making her playable isn't the only one. Look, speaking as someone who is very frail and feminine, I doubt I would see myself in a tough, adventurous, heroic Princess Zelda. But I certainly don't see myself in a woman whose primary role is to give a man someone to save. Anyway, that little bit aside, once you get to the bottom of the crumbling ruins of the castle, you fight against the big boar with swords himself, Ganondorf's monstrous form, simply called Ganon. And yeah, it's a stunner. You don't need me to tell you that it's dramatic and exciting to fight a big guy who has big swords on an island on a lake of lava. You don't need me to tell you how cool it is that you see the big guy in silhouette, lit only by his burning yellow eyes and the occasional flash of lightning. I say all this with a wry tone, but make no mistake, I think this is just as cool as you do, and I think the ending, where Princess Zelda sends Link back to live out his childhood, is bittersweet in a dramatically satisfying way. But I'm not here to pay obligatory respects to the parts that everybody already knows are good and cool. I want to talk about the parts preceding the cool ending sequence, the parts that may work pretty well or may not, but aren't necessarily looked at in depth either way. By the time you reach the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, you have a good idea of what Link can do and how he moves around the world. By that point, his idiosyncrasies have become second nature. The gaming podcast Watch Out for Fireballs has an episode where the hosts discuss Ocarina of Time, and they coin an expression that I find pretty interesting. Quote, "You Zelda across the room." Unquote, using Zelda as a verb. The general sentiment is that it's often difficult to describe the gameplay of Ocarina of Time because so much of it consists of Zelda-ing across the room. That is to say, you just take a look at a given room's challenge and you get a natural sense of what you're supposed to do. This is a useful concept, but where I disagree with the hosts is in the idea that this makes the gameplay of Ocarina of Time trivial. Rather, I think that the process of getting the player to the point where they can just Zelda across a room is a major part of what these games are about. For all the faults I discussed, I think the dungeon inside Ganon's castle is successful not because it challenges the player, but because it gives them a set of rooms that they can Zelda across with relative ease by the time they get there. You've come a long way from when you were bumbling around Kokiri Forest looking for spare change. For all my difficulties breaking things down into neat categories, I find it surprisingly easy to categorize all of Ocarina of Time's dungeons into one of two types. There are dungeons where the challenge primarily lies in navigating individual rooms, and dungeons where the challenge primarily lies in exploring and understanding the dungeon as a whole. Obviously, the dungeon inside Ganon's castle, with its clearly marked sections and complete lack of interconnectivity, is all about its individual rooms. That's true of most of the dungeons and mini-dungeons in the Silver Rupee arc, but it is especially true of the Shadow Temple.